Good evening. The International Atomic Energy Agency just delivered the most terrifying assessment of this entire crisis. Iran's buried uranium stockpile could yield maybe a dozen nuclear bombs if Tehran decides to enrich further and construct warheads. A dozen bombs. Not one or two that might be eliminated through limited surgical strikes. 12 functional nuclear weapons that would require comprehensive military operations to destroy before Iran disperses them to hardened facilities across the country, making elimination impossible. And this catastrophic revelation triggered an emergency response from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who literally raced to Washington, moving his scheduled meeting with President Donald Trump up by an entire week because Netanyahu understands that Iran approaching 12-bomb capability is an existential threat that requires immediate coordinated American-Israeli action before the window for prevention closes permanently. Netanyahu flew to Washington desperately seeking help, seeking American commitment to either force Iran's complete surrender through overwhelming pressure or authorize joint military strikes that eliminate the threat before weaponization occurs. But after 3 hours of intense closed-door discussions, Trump emerged with a statement that shocked Netanyahu and Israeli officials. Trump said he insisted to Netanyahu that Iran talks must continue, that America should keep pursuing a deal with Iran rather than moving to military action at this time. At this time, Trump is prioritizing diplomacy even after learning Iran is weeks away from having enough fissile material for 12 nuclear weapons. Netanyahu came to Washington seeking military coordination and support. Trump responded by insisting on continued negotiations with a regime that just declared their missile program completely non-negotiable, that massacred thousands of protesters and is hiding their supreme leader because he's too terrified to appear publicly. This disconnect between Netanyahu's urgency and Trump's diplomatic insistence reveals a fundamental disagreement about timing, strategy, and acceptable risk levels. Netanyahu believes Iran must be stopped now before 12 bombs become reality. Trump believes diplomacy deserves more time even as the uranium stockpile grows and Iran refuses to negotiate comprehensively. And this disagreement could determine whether Israel acts independently, whether America coordinates reluctantly, or whether both countries watch helplessly as Iran crosses the nuclear threshold while everyone is still talking about deals that Iran has already declared impossible by refusing to discuss missiles. The IAEA warning is clear. Netanyahu's plea for help is desperate. And Trump's insistence on deals reveals America might not be ready to do what's necessary when it's necessary. That's the crisis within the crisis. Let me start with the IAEA assessment because this changes everything about Iran's nuclear timeline and the urgency required to prevent weaponization. IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi briefed member states that Iran has accumulated enough enriched uranium at various purity levels that if they decided to push enrichment to 90% weapons grade and construct warheads, they could potentially produce fissile material for maybe a dozen nuclear bombs. Grossi was careful with his language, using maybe because exact numbers depend on technical factors like enrichment efficiency, material losses during processing, and warhead design specifications. But the assessment is based on comprehensive data from IAEA inspections, uranium accounting, satellite imagery of Iranian facilities, and technical analysis of centrifuge operations. And even conservative estimates suggest Iran could produce weapons-grade uranium for at least 10 bombs, possibly 12 or more, if they devoted all existing stockpiles and operational centrifuges to maximum weapons production. This is catastrophic for several reasons. First, it proves Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025 didn't eliminate Iran's nuclear program. American B-2 bombers destroyed Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan facilities with devastating precision. But Iran rebuilt enough capacity over the past 8 months to accumulate near weapons quantities of uranium. They did this using backup facilities that weren't targeted, by rapidly repairing damaged equipment, and by running remaining centrifuges at maximum capacity 24 hours daily. Second, the timeline for Iran reaching weapons capability is measured in weeks, not months or years. Iran currently has uranium enriched to 60% purity. The technical process to go from 60% to 90% weapons grade is well understood and relatively quick with Iran's existing centrifuge technology. If Supreme Leader Khamenei ordered maximum weaponization today, Technical experts estimate Iran could have weapons-grade uranium for multiple bombs within 2 to 4 weeks. Third, once Iran has fissile material for 12 bombs, preventing weaponization becomes exponentially more difficult because Iran can disperse material to multiple locations, making comprehensive elimination through airstrikes nearly impossible without knowing every storage site. And fourth, this assessment proves every week of continued failed diplomacy is a week Iran gets closer to irreversible nuclear weapons capability that changes Middle East power dynamics permanently. And Netanyahu understands these timelines better than anyone because Israeli intelligence has been tracking Iran's nuclear program for decades. When Netanyahu learned about the IAEA assessment showing dozen bombs capability, he immediately recognized this as the moment Israel has been warning about for years, the moment when Iran's nuclear program transitions from manageable threat to existential crisis, the moment when preventive action becomes urgent necessity. And Netanyahu's response was to race to Washington seeking American help. Originally, Netanyahu was scheduled to meet Trump from February 18th through 22nd, a full week of meetings allowing time for detailed discussions about Iran strategy, Gaza issues, and regional coordination. But Netanyahu demanded the meeting be moved up immediately. Trump agreed. The new date became Wednesday, February 12th. That's 6 days earlier than planned, demonstrating urgency that couldn't wait for normal scheduling. And the reason Netanyahu raced to Washington is because he believes only direct personal engagement with Trump can prevent a catastrophic outcome where America makes a limited nuclear deal with Iran that ignores missiles and proxies while providing sanctions relief that helps Iran's regime survive and eventually weaponize their uranium stockpile. Netanyahu's worst nightmare is Trump accepting a nuclear-only agreement similar to the failed 2015 framework. Iran freezes enrichment temporarily, allows some inspections, gets sanctions relief and economic recovery, but Iran keeps their ballistic missiles aimed at Israeli cities. Iran keeps funding Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis. And within years, Iran either breaks out of the agreement like they did before or simply waits for it to expire and then weaponizes having used the intervening time to strengthen their position economically and militarily. Netanyahu came to Washington to tell Trump directly, "We cannot accept nuclear-only deals, we cannot tolerate Iran having missiles plus nuclear capability, and we need American commitment to either force Iran's complete surrender on all fronts or coordinate military operations that eliminate the threat before those dozen potential bombs become reality." But Trump's response after 3 hours of meetings was not what Netanyahu hoped to hear. Trump told reporters he insisted to Netanyahu that Iran talks must go on, that he wants to keep pursuing a deal with Iran rather than moving to military action at this time. Insisted. That strong language suggesting Netanyahu pushed for immediate military coordination and Trump resisted, insisting on continued diplomacy. And Trump's framing reveals his priorities. He wants a deal. He prefers negotiation over military action. And he's willing to give talks more time despite the IAEA warning about dozen bombs because Trump believes diplomatic solutions are still possible if Iran shows sufficient flexibility. But here's the fundamental problem with Trump's approach. The Trump administration says its talks with Iran are focused on 3 pillars: the nuclear program, ballistic missiles, and support for proxy forces. All 3 must be addressed for any agreement to be acceptable. But Iran's foreign minister, a Khamenei advisor, and IRGC officials all declared simultaneously that missiles are completely non-negotiable, that Iran will never discuss ballistic missiles in any agreement, and that any American military action triggered by missile demands would spread war across the entire region. Non-negotiable. So Trump wants talks that address 3 pillars. Iran says one of those pillars cannot be discussed. That's mathematical impossibility. How do you negotiate comprehensive agreement when one side declares a third of the issues off limits? You can't. Which means Trump's insistence on continuing talks is really just delaying the inevitable moment when diplomacy fails and military options return as the only remaining way to address threats Iran refuses to negotiate. And Netanyahu knows this, which is why he came to Washington seeking military coordination rather than diplomatic encouragement. Netanyahu understands talks are failing in real time because Iran's positions are incompatible with Israeli security requirements. But Trump apparently believes more negotiating time might produce breakthrough or flexibility that changes Iran's calculus. And that disagreement about whether diplomacy can succeed creates tension between what Netanyahu needs and what Trump is willing to provide. And Netanyahu made his position explicit during the meeting by pressing for military freedom of action. According to sources familiar with the discussions, Netanyahu essentially requested American approval or at minimum acceptance of potential Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear and missile facilities if diplomatic talks produce inadequate results that leave Israel facing existential threats. This is Netanyahu saying to Trump, if your negotiations don't solve our problem, we're going to solve it ourselves through military force. And we need to know whether America will support us, oppose us, or stay neutral when we act. Trump's response was reportedly that he wants more time for diplomacy before considering military options. But significantly, Trump didn't forbid Israeli action and didn't threaten consequences if Israel strikes independently. That's tacit acknowledgement that Israel might act regardless of American preferences if talks fail to satisfy Israeli security needs. But it's not the enthusiastic support or coordination Netanyahu was seeking. It's more like Trump saying, I'd prefer you wait while I try diplomacy, but I understand you might not wait if I can't deliver results. That's a weak position for America to be in because it means Trump loses control over timing and scope of potential military operations. If Israel strikes Iran on their own timeline using their own plans, Iran will likely retaliate against American forces throughout the Middle East anyway, thinking Washington ordered or approved the attacks. So America gets dragged into war regardless, except without the coordination and planning that joint operations would provide. Netanyahu understands this dynamic and is using it as leverage. He's telling Trump either we coordinate now on comprehensive action that eliminates all threats, or Israel acts alone soon and you deal with the consequences. And Trump's insistence on continued talks is his way of trying to maintain control by promising he'll get results through negotiation that make Israeli strikes unnecessary. But Netanyahu is deeply skeptical because he's heard American promises about Iran deals before and watched them fail. Meanwhile, the IAEA warning about dozen bombs is forcing recognition that Iran's nuclear breakout capability is no longer theoretical future threat. It's immediate present danger. Iran has uranium enriched to 60% purity. That's very close to the 90% needed for weapons. The technical gap between 60 and 90% is not trivial, but it's achievable with Iran's existing centrifuge technology within weeks if they decide to weaponize. And Iran has enough material at various enrichment levels that even accounting for losses during processing, they could potentially produce fissile cores for 10 to 12 bombs, according to IAEA calculations. This means Iran is essentially a political decision away from nuclear weapons capability. Khamenei could order maximum enrichment tomorrow, and Iran would have bomb-grade uranium before Trump's next round of negotiations even concludes. That's the timeline pressure Netanyahu is operating under. But Trump seems to believe he has months to pursue diplomacy when the actual window might be weeks. And this perception gap about urgency is dangerous because it could lead to America pursuing negotiations that take too long while Iran crosses thresholds that make military options far more difficult and risky. Netanyahu came to Washington to bridge that perception gap, to convince Trump that dozen bombs means immediate crisis requiring urgent action, not patient diplomacy. But Trump's insistence on continued talks suggests he's not fully convinced or he's willing to accept higher risks in pursuit of diplomatic solutions. And that leaves Netanyahu with an impossible choice: trust Trump's diplomacy despite evidence it's failing, or prepare Israeli independent action that might succeed militarily but damage relations with America politically. And Israel is actively preparing those independent options even while giving Trump diplomatic time. The Israeli Defense Ministry just announced successful completion of complex David Sling missile defense tests based on operational lessons learned during the June 2025 war with Iran. David Sling intercepts medium to long-range ballistic and cruise missiles, exactly the threats Iran poses through their non-negotiable missile arsenal. Israel is ensuring defensive systems function perfectly when Iranian missiles launch in retaliation for potential strikes. And Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich just revealed operational details about June's mission that prove Israel can strike Iran successfully, even under worst-case scenarios. Smotrich disclosed that during Operation Midnight Hammer, Hezbollah detected Israeli F-35 jets mid-flight and immediately warned Iran that attacks were incoming. This should have given Iran crucial minutes to scramble defenses, activate air defense systems, and prepare to intercept Israeli aircraft. But despite receiving this warning, Israeli commanders completely rewrote the entire strike plan in 1 hour while jets were already flying, pivoted to different targets including high-value nuclear scientists, and successfully completed the mission, eliminating critical personnel and facilities without losing a single aircraft. This proves Israeli operational flexibility and technological superiority are so overwhelming that even advance warning doesn't help Iran defend themselves. And Smotrich revealed this story during Netanyahu's Washington visit to send a message to both Trump and Iran. The message to Trump is, Israel has proven capability to strike successfully even under adverse conditions. So if your diplomacy fails, we can act independently and achieve objectives. The message to Iran is, your defenses are worthless, warnings don't save you, and we can eliminate your nuclear scientists and facilities whenever we decide to act. This revelation also puts pressure on Trump's diplomatic timeline because it demonstrates Israel doesn't need to wait for American coordination to strike effectively. They can and will act alone if Trump's talks take too long or produce inadequate results. But while Netanyahu is in Washington seeking help and Trump is insisting on deals, Iran's internal situation continues deteriorating in ways that should make Trump's diplomatic optimism questionable. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was completely absent from Revolution Day celebrations on February 11th, missing the Islamic Republic's most important annual propaganda event for the first time in 37 years. Flight tracking data suggests Khamenei fled Tehran to hide in Mashhad, 600 miles away, because he's terrified of assassination or American midnight hammer strikes targeting his location during predictable public events. A leader who's too afraid to appear at his own regime's anniversary celebration is a leader whose government is failing. And Israeli intelligence reports confirmed by multiple independent sources show Iran has secretly executed thousands of detained protesters in recent weeks, shooting or strangling them in detention centers and disposing of bodies to hide the scale of killings. Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi furiously denied these reports, calling Israeli media Miriam Adelson's mouthpiece and dismissing the intelligence as fabrication. But the evidence from hospital data, witness testimonies, mortuary records, and forensic analysis is overwhelming. Iran killed at least 1,800 people in Tehran alone during January 8th protests, with thousands more executed afterward in systematic effort to eliminate internal opposition. And despite this murderous crackdown, protesters were still heard chanting "Death to Khamenei" during Revolution Day rallies, risking immediate execution to publicly oppose the supreme leader. This is a population that's reached a breaking point where hatred of the regime outweighs fear of consequences. This is internal instability that could explode into full revolution if external pressure through American or Israeli strikes eliminates regime leadership and creates power vacuum. And this is the context Trump should understand when evaluating whether diplomatic engagement with Iran's government makes sense. You're negotiating with a regime that's massacring its own population, hiding its supreme leader, refusing to discuss core security issues, and facing potential internal collapse. That's not a partner for sustainable agreements. That's a dying government trying to buy time through negotiations while preparing for conflict they know is inevitable. And Iran is simultaneously making threats designed to deter military action while revealing desperation rather than strength. Iranian officials warned that if war breaks out, Iran will close the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil passes, causing massive economic disruption worldwide. They warned that war would spread across the region, affecting oil markets and international stability in ways America cannot control. And they claimed Iran's navy guarantees the economic security of the world's shipping lanes while simultaneously threatening to close those exact lanes if attacked. These are contradictory messages that reveal psychological warfare aimed at deterring American action through economic fear. But Trump has already calculated these risks and apparently decided they're manageable because temporary oil disruptions are acceptable costs for permanently eliminating Iran's nuclear weapons capability. What Trump seems less willing to accept is the political cost of authorizing military strikes before exhausting diplomatic options, which is why he's insisting talks continue despite evidence they're failing. Trump wants to demonstrate to American voters, international allies, and domestic critics that he tried everything peaceful before ordering military operations. That's politically understandable, but strategically dangerous if diplomatic delays allow Iran to cross nuclear thresholds that make military options exponentially more difficult and costly. Netanyahu came to Washington to warn Trump about exactly this risk, that pursuing diplomacy too long could result in missing the window for effective preventive action. But Trump's insistence on continued talks suggests he's willing to accept that risk in pursuit of negotiated solutions he believes remain possible. And some reports suggest U.S. and Iran are showing flexibility on nuclear deal terms, with Iran possibly willing to reduce enrichment levels or allow increased inspections in exchange for partial sanctions relief. This flexibility is what gives Trump hope that deals remain achievable. But notice what Iran is not showing flexibility on: missiles and proxies. Iran might offer nuclear concessions to keep talks alive and split the difference between their positions and American demands. But if missiles remain non-negotiable, then any nuclear flexibility is tactical maneuvering rather than strategic concessions, because the deal still fails to address Israeli security concerns. Netanyahu fears exactly this outcome: Trump making a nuclear-focused agreement that provides Iran with economic benefits while leaving Israeli cities vulnerable to missile attacks from an enemy that's publicly declared missiles untouchable in negotiations. That's why Netanyahu raced to Washington. That's why he pressed for military freedom of action. That's why he's preparing David's Sling defenses and revealing Hezbollah warning stories. Because Netanyahu sees Trump potentially making the same mistake Obama made in 2015, accepting limited agreements that pause threats temporarily rather than eliminating threats permanently. And Netanyahu came to Washington seeking help to prevent that mistake, to convince Trump that comprehensive solutions requiring Iran's complete surrender on nuclear missiles and proxies are the only acceptable outcomes. But Trump's insistence on continued talks despite Iran's non-negotiable position suggests Trump might accept partial solutions that Netanyahu considers catastrophic. And that disconnect between what Netanyahu needs and what Trump might deliver is the crisis that drove Netanyahu to race to Washington, desperately seeking help that Trump might not be ready to provide. The IAEA warning is clear: Iran could produce fissile material for maybe a dozen nuclear bombs. Netanyahu's response is urgent: race to Washington seeking American commitment to stop this before it's too late. But Trump's position is cautious: insist on continued diplomatic talks rather than military action at this time. And Iran's stance is defiant: missiles are non-negotiable regardless of other concessions. These four positions cannot coexist peacefully. Either Iran surrenders comprehensively, which they've shown no willingness to do, or Trump authorizes military strikes he's currently resisting, or Netanyahu acts independently, which Trump wants to avoid, or everyone keeps talking while Iran enriches uranium closer to weapons capability and positions more missiles threatening Israeli population centers. The fourth option is what's actually happening right now, which means the crisis isn't being resolved, just delayed. And every day of delay is a day closer to Iran having dozen bombs that transform Middle East power dynamics permanently. Netanyahu raced to Washington seeking help. Trump responded by insisting on deals. But if those deals fail because Iran refuses to negotiate comprehensively, and if Trump's diplomatic insistence delays action until Iran crosses nuclear threshold, then Netanyahu's plea for help will have been rejected, and Israel will face the exact nightmare scenario that drove the emergency Washington trip: Iran with nuclear weapons capability and missiles to deliver them, while America is still talking about agreements that Iran has already made impossible by declaring core issues non-negotiable. That's why the IAEA warning matters. That's why Netanyahu raced to Washington. And that's why Trump's insistence on deals, despite evidence they're failing, could be the mistake that allows Iran to become nuclear armed while everyone was still negotiating about how to prevent it.